Most of us were taught that in the winter of 1637, an entire country lost its mind over a flower. The Dutch Republic, richest place on earth, went collectively insane. Weavers abandoned their looms, chimney sweeps mortgaged their houses, a single bulb changed hands for the price of a canal-side mansion. Then, in February, the price broke, the country was ruined, and Europe learned its first lesson about speculative bubbles. Every textbook on financial manias opens with it. Every pundit reaches for it whenever an asset goes up faster than he thinks it should. It is a tidy story, it is also dangerously unreliable, and in the detail that matters most, it is flat out wrong. Because almost nobody lost any money. The most thorough archival study ever done on Tulip Mania went looking for ruined men in the notarial records of the Dutch towns where the trade actually happened, and could not find a single person who went bankrupt because of it. Not one. What collapsed in February 1637 was not a price. It was the willingness to honor a promise. And the catastrophe you have heard about was not written by anyone who was there. It was assembled 200 years later by a Scottish journalist who read satire and mistook it for reporting. Here is what is coming. A futures market that had been illegal for 27 years and worked anyway, because both parties signed a clause agreeing to ignore the law. An auction on the 5th of February 1637 that set the highest bulb prices ever recorded 2 days after the market had supposedly already crashed. The fact that the most valuable object in Europe was a sick plant, and that nobody understood why, until a woman in an English laboratory worked it out in 1928. A settlement rate that the Dutch authorities eventually landed on, which was not 50% or 20%, it was 3.5%. So let's go back, not to 1637 and not to a tulip field, but to 1608, and to a furious man in Amsterdam who had just been forced out of the company he helped create. His name was Isaac Lemaire, and he had been one of the founding directors of the Dutch East India Company. He left under a cloud, owing the company money and nursing a grudge, and in 1608 he did something that had never been done in the history of markets. He assembled a syndicate of about 10 men, and together they began selling shares in the company that none of them owned. Understand the mechanism, because everything that follows depends on it. They signed contracts promising to deliver company shares at a fixed price on a date in the future. They did not have the shares. The plan was to spread bad news about the company, watch the price fall, buy the shares cheaply just before delivery, hand them over, and pocket the difference. This is a bear raid, and Lemaire's is the first one anybody has documented. It very nearly worked, and it frightened the Dutch authorities badly. On the 27th of February 1610, they issued a ban on selling shares you did not possess. Historians of finance generally call it the first securities regulation anywhere in the world. And here is where the Dutch did something extraordinary, which almost nobody mentions when they tell you about tulips. They did not stop trading forward contracts. They invented a workaround. Traders began writing a clause into the contract in which both parties formally renounced their legal rights and declared that they would take no notice of the ban. Read that again slowly. 2 men signed a document that explicitly stated the document could not be enforced in court. The whole apparatus ran on reputation. If you failed to settle, nobody could make you pay. What could happen to you was that the men you dealt with, who were also the men you prayed beside and married your children to, would stop dealing with you. That is the machine. A functioning futures market with no legal enforcement, running entirely on honor, operating in the wealthiest and most heavily commercial society in Europe. It existed for a generation before anyone thought to load a flower into it. And honor was not a soft word in the Dutch Republic, it was infrastructure. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank had been founded in 1609 to make payment between merchants reliable, but for everything below the level of great international houses, Dutch commerce ran on personal credit. Shopkeepers carried customers for months. Craftsmen bought materials on the promise of payment after sale. Ordinary households were simultaneously debtors and creditors to a dozen neighbors, and the ledger that held it all together was reputation. In a system like that, being known as a man who does not pay is not an inconvenience. It is the end of your commercial life. That was the enforcement mechanism, and for a generation of forward contracts and company shares, it worked well enough. What nobody had tested was what would happen if a large number of respectable men decided, all at once and for the same reason, that they would rather take the reputational damage than pay. Now consider the flower, because the tulip was not chosen at random. Tulips reached Western Europe from Ottoman lands in the 16th century, and the man who did most to establish them in the Low Countries was the botanist Carolus Clusius, who planted a collection at Leiden in the 1590s. They were exotic, they were slow to propagate, and above all they did something no European flower did. Occasionally a plain tulip would produce a bloom streaked and flamed with a second color, in patterns that never repeated exactly. The Dutch called these broken tulips, and they were what the enormous prices were paid for. The plain ones were cheap. Nobody in the 17th century knew what caused the breaking. Growers had theories involving soil, pigeon dung, and the phase of the moon. The truth was not established until 1928, when a mycologist named Dorothy Cayley, working at the John Innes Horticultural Institution in England, demonstrated that the pattern could be transferred from an infected plant to a healthy one. It was not heredity. It was infection. Breaking is caused by a virus, carried between plants by aphids, and now the part that ought to stop you. The virus that made a tulip valuable also made it sick. An infected bulb grows stunted. It produces fewer offsets, which is how bulbs reproduce. Over successive generations it weakens, loses the strength to flower, and the line dies out. The most expensive object in 17th century Europe was an organism that was killing itself, and that could not be reliably reproduced by anyone at any price. Semper Augustus, the most famous tulip in history, the one whose price is quoted in every account of the mania, no longer exists anywhere on earth. The disease that made it beautiful finished it. There is a second consequence of the biology that shaped the entire market, and it is easy to miss. A tulip flowers for about a week in spring. For the rest of the year, it is an object the approximate size and appearance of an onion. If you were buying in December, you could not look at what you were buying, and neither could anyone else. The Dutch solution to this was one of the more beautiful improvisations in commercial history. Growers commissioned tulip books, albums of watercolors showing each variety in bloom, sometimes with the weight of the bulb noted beside the painting. Dozens of these survive in Dutch collections. They were sales catalogs. They were also, in effect, the prospectus for an asset that could not be inspected, produced by the party selling it, describing a flower that would not appear for another 6 months and might not look like the painting when it did. So we have a market with no legal enforcement, and a product whose supply genuinely could not be expanded. Now watch what the Dutch built on top of that. Until about 1634, tulips were traded as objects. You bought a bulb, you took it home, you planted it. From 1634 onward, the trade shifted. And the shift is the entire story. Bulbs began to be sold by weight while still in the ground, measured in a unit called the A's, roughly a 20th of a gram. The bulb would be lifted in June. The contract was signed in December, which meant that during the winter months, when the whole trade reached its peak, nobody delivered anything, and nobody paid anything. Buyers were purchasing a promise about an object they had never seen from a man they knew socially, under a contract that had been drafted to be legally void, to be settled at some point the following summer. The Dutch had a word for this: wind handle, trade in wind. It was not conducted on the Amsterdam Exchange, which had barred tulip speculation. It happened in taverns, in informal societies the traders called colleges, with their own rituals and their own rules. Those rituals were elaborate, and they tell you what kind of market this really was. Bidding was often done in a closed system, with buyer and seller each writing a number on a slate and a pair of arbiters splitting the difference. A deal could be refused, but refusing cost you a fine paid into the pot. The only money that changed hands on the night of a deal was a small sum called wine money, which paid for the drinking that accompanied every transaction. The trade did not have a clearinghouse, a margin requirement, or a mechanism for forcing anybody to do anything. It had a tavern, a slate, a bottle, and a reputation. I want to be careful here, because this is where the popular account inserts the weavers and the chimney sweeps, and the archives do not support them. The people in those taverns were merchants, brewers, master craftsmen, and skilled artisans. They were the solid commercial middle of Dutch society. They were disproportionately connected to one another by family, trade, and church, and there were not very many of them. We can be specific about how few. The historian Anne Goldgar, who spent years in the notarial and court archives, identified roughly 350 people involved in the tulip trade in total. Around 285 of them were in Haarlem, a city of about 42,000. Around 60 were in Amsterdam, a city of 120,000. 25 were in Enkhuizen. She is careful to say the true figure is higher, because she did not read every town's records. But the order of magnitude is not in doubt. This was not a nation. It was a network. There is one more piece of context that the moralizing version leaves out entirely, and it is grim. The Dutch Republic was in the middle of a severe outbreak of plague. It moved through the towns of Holland in the mid-1630s, and Haarlem, the center of the tulip trade, was among the places hit hardest. In some Dutch towns in those years, the burial registers record mortality on a scale that emptied whole streets. What that does to an economy is not simple. Labor became scarce, and wages rose, which put money in exactly the hands of the artisans and craftsmen who show up in the tulip records. Estates were being settled and dispersed, which is why bulbs kept arriving at auction from the property of the recently dead, And there is a harder thing to measure, which is what a season of mass death does to a person's appetite for a wager. Garber's phrase for the final weeks of the trade is a winter drinking game played by a plague-ridden population, and while that is a judgment rather than a finding, it is not an unreasonable one. And then, in the winter of 1636 into 1637, the numbers went vertical. The clearest surviving series is for a common variety called Switzer. On the last day of December 1636, a pound of Switzer bulbs was worth about 125 guilders. On the 1st of February 1637, the same pound was worth around 1,500. That is a 12-fold increase in a single month, in a bulb that nobody considered rare. To make sense of a guilder, hold on to one benchmark. A skilled craftsman earned somewhere in the region of 300 guilders a year. A few years after the mania, Rembrandt was paid about 1,600 guilders for the enormous group portrait we now call the Night Watch. The most expensive tulip receipts Goldgar could actually document ran to about 5,000 guilders, which in 1637 would buy a good house in Amsterdam. The famous figures are shakier than they look, and I am going to be honest about that, rather than pick the number that sounds best. A Viceroy bulb is recorded at 3,000 guilders and a heavier one at over 4,000. For Semper Augustus, the estimates in the literature genuinely conflict. One reconstruction has it rising from around 1,000 guilders in the 1620s to 10,000 by 1637. The economist Peter Garber, working from different records, puts a Semper Augustus sale at 2,000 guilders in 1625. I am not going to pretend those reconcile, but here is a number that does hold up, and it is the one that should have killed the legend a century ago. Out of all the transactions Goldgar could document, only 37 people are recorded paying more than 300 guilders for a single bulb. 37, in a republic of nearly 2 million. The peak came on the 5th of February 1637 at an auction in Alkmaar. The bulbs belonged to the estate of a man who had died, and the proceeds were destined for his orphaned children. The sale is generally reckoned to have raised around 90,000 guilders in a single day, the highest tulip prices ever realized. Now hold that date in your mind, because 2 days earlier, on the 3rd of February, an auctioneer in Haarlem had stood in front of a room and failed to find a single buyer. That is the crash. Not a stampede, not a panic on a trading floor. A room in Haarlem where nobody raised a hand, and a record-breaking auction in Alkmaar 48 hours later because the news had not traveled and the estate sale was already scheduled. What happened next is the part that has been almost entirely erased from the popular story, and it is the part that actually matters. Buyers stopped paying, not in a wave of bankruptcies. They simply refused to settle. The bulbs were still in the ground, so nothing had been delivered, and nothing was owed in the ordinary sense. Sellers demanded their money, buyers produced reasons why they should not have to hand it over, and some of those reasons were flimsy and some of them were not, and behind all of them sat the fact everyone in the room already knew. The contract had been written to be unenforceable. The trade tried to organize. On the 7th of February, growers in Utrecht elected representatives. Around the 23rd and 24th of February, the tulip dealers met in Amsterdam and proposed a compromise that contracts agreed before December 1636 should stand, and that anything signed after that could be cancelled by the buyer for 10% of the price. In early March, the Haarlem authorities suspended trades made since the previous planting. The dispute went upward to the Court of Holland, which did something governments almost never get credit for. It declined. It refused to enforce the contracts and told the parties to settle among themselves. Cases were still working through the courts in 1639. The final settlement came from a commission in Haarlem in May 1638. A buyer could walk away from a tulip contract by paying the seller 3.5% of the agreed price. There is a Dutch word for that kind of payment, rouwkoop, which translates roughly as grief money. Sit with what that means. A man who had contracted to pay 1,000 guilders for a bulb paid 35 and walked away. The Dutch state did not bail anybody out, and it did not confiscate anything. It reached back into thousands of signed agreements and retroactively converted them from obligations into options. That is not a bubble bursting. That is a legal system declining to turn paper promises into debts and telling an entire market to absorb the loss privately. So where did the ruined weavers come from? They came from pamphlets. Between February and May 1637, a printer in Haarlem named Adrian Roman published a series of dialogues between two invented characters, Wermont and Gergouet, whose names translate roughly as true mouth and greedy good. They are satires. They were written to moralize in a society with a long and well-developed tradition of using comic verse to attack luxury and greed. They are also, unfortunately, the most detailed contemporary source we have. In 1797, a German scholar named Johann Beckmann included an account of the tulip trade in his History of Inventions, drawing heavily on those dialogues. And in 1841, A Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay published Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, took Beckman's account, sharpened it, and gave the world the version it still repeats. The chimney sweeps are Mackay's, the 12 acres of land offered for a single bulb is Mackay's, the ruined nation is Mackay's. Mackay was not committing fraud. He was doing what popular writers did in 1841. He found a vivid source, he did not ask what kind of document it was, and he wrote it up. His book has almost no footnotes. It has also never been out of print. What happened afterwards is how a story becomes a fact. In the 20th century, the Dutch economic historian Nicolaas Postumus assembled serious price data on the tulip trade, which gave the episode numerical respectability. Cultural historians took it up as an emblem of the anxieties of a suddenly rich society. Then finance took it, and this is the step that mattered commercially, because when Burton Malkiel put Tulip Mania into the opening pages of a best-selling investment book, it stopped being history and became a parable that every new investor is handed in their first week. At each stage, the story got shorter, more confident, and further from any document. By the time it reaches a modern trading floor, it is 4 words long. One journalist, one chapter, 1 century of repetition. That is the whole provenance of the most famous economic disaster in Western memory. The scholarly counterattack came in 3 waves, and they disagree with each other in useful ways. The first was economic. In 1990, Peter Garber published an analysis arguing that most of what looks insane about tulip prices is simply what the market for any rare bulb looks like. A new variety is scarce, commands an enormous price, then falls steadily as growers multiply it. Using 18th century bulb data, he found rare varieties depreciating at around 28% a year, as a matter of course. Tracking bulbs from February 1637 forward, he found an average annual decline of about 32%, almost identical. He also compared the tulips to hyacinths, which became fashionable later, and whose top varieties fell to a tiny fraction of peak value within 30 years, with no legend attached and no national ruin. Garber deserves credit for what he does not claim. He concedes that the vertical move in common bulbs in January and February 1637 is hard to explain by fundamentals, and he describes that final phase, memorably, as a winter drinking game played by a plague-ridden population. The second wave was legal. In 2007, the economist Earl Thompson argued that the late prices were not really prices at all, because the conversion of futures into options was widely anticipated. If everyone expects a contract to be settled at a fraction of face value, then the face value stops, meaning what it appears to mean. The third wave, in the same year, was archival, and it did the most damage. Anne Goldgar's book went to the notarial records, the court files, and the estate inventories. She found the small network. She found the absence of bankruptcies. She found tulip traders continuing to buy houses and paintings after 1637, and the Dutch economy continuing its long climb for another century. Her conclusion is that the real damage was not financial at all. It was social. In a commercial society that ran on personal credit and personal reputation, several hundred respectable men had just discovered that the others might not pay. I want to give you the objection to all of this, because the revision can be pushed too far, and some popular retellings now overshoot into claiming that nothing happened at all. Something happened. The price series are real. A 12-fold move in a common bulb in 1 month is not an artifact. The courts were genuinely clogged into 1639. And if you were one of the 37 men who had signed for more than a year's income, the fact that you eventually escaped for 3.5% does not mean the intervening year was comfortable. There is also a methodological limit worth stating plainly. An absence of recorded bankruptcies is evidence from an archive that does not record everything, and Goldgar herself is arguing about scale and consequence, not claiming the episode was invented. The honest position is narrower than either legend. Prices rose sharply and fell sharply in a small, socially dense market. Very little wealth actually moved, because the settlement system was designed not to move it, and the story of national catastrophe is a later construction. Now, let me bring all of these threads together, because the pattern only appears when you set them side by side. A futures market that Dutch law had prohibited in 1610. A contractual clause in which both parties agreed the contract could not be enforced. A product whose value came from a virus, whose supply therefore could not be expanded, and which was slowly destroying itself. A trading network of a few hundred men who knew each other through family, guild, and congregation. A winter in which nothing was delivered and nothing was paid because the bulbs were underground. A price that went vertical in about 8 weeks. A failed auction in one town and a record auction in another 2 days later. A mass refusal to settle. A court that declined to intervene. A commission that ended it at 3.5%. And 2 centuries afterwards, a journalist with a vivid source and no footnotes. any one of those as a curiosity. In sequence, they are not a mania at all. They are a description of what happens when a market runs on promises that everyone has agreed in advance not to enforce. Step down from the price series for a moment, because there were people inside this. The thing that makes Goldgar's archive so uncomfortable is how well these men knew one another. They were not anonymous counterparties. They were in the same guilds, the same militia companies, the same churches. A tulip contract was frequently signed between men whose families had done business for a generation. That was not incidental to the trade. It was the collateral. In the absence of a court that would enforce anything, the only security a seller had was that the buyer had to keep living in the same town. So when the payments stopped, what broke was not a balance sheet. It was the assumption that a man's word in a tavern was the same thing as a debt. Neighbors went to notaries about neighbors. Men who had stood at each other's weddings sent formal demands. For a society whose entire commercial machinery ran on personal credit, that was a far more disturbing event than a fall in the price of a flower, and it is the part the pamphlets could not make funny. There is a particular kind of case that recurs in the records. A buyer would refuse on a technicality, arguing that the bulb was misdescribed, or that the weight was wrong, or that the agreement had been made when he had been drinking. A seller would insist that the deal had been witnessed. Arbitration panels were assembled out of the same small pool of men, which meant the arbiter was frequently a friend of both parties and a rival of one. Some disputes were settled at a fraction, some were abandoned, and a great many were simply left to go quiet. Then it passed. The traders went on trading. Fewer than 6 prominent dealers appear to have run into any lasting financial trouble. The Dutch Republic went on to a century of dominance in global commerce, finance, and shipping. The disaster left almost no economic footprint at all, which is precisely why the archives are so quiet, and precisely why the legend had to be supplied from outside. Which brings us to why this still matters, and here I want to be careful, because it would be easy to turn this into a claim that nothing is ever overpriced. That is not the argument. The argument is about what the tulip story does to thinking. It has become the universal shorthand for any asset somebody dislikes. Reach for it, and you have said something that sounds like analysis without having examined anything. The tulip comparison implies that the danger lives in the psychology of buyers, in mania, in madness, in crowds. But the 17th century Dutch episode was not primarily about psychology. It was about plumbing. Who is on the other side of the contract? Whether the contract can be enforced? Who eats the loss when it cannot? Those are the questions that determined the outcome in 1637, and they are the questions that determine outcomes now in every market where an instrument is settled privately and the enforcement is thinner than it looks. Notice what the Dutch case actually teaches, because it is close to the opposite of the usual moral. The tulip trade did not destroy Dutch wealth, and the reason it did not is that its contracts were unenforceable. Nobody could be compelled to hand over a year's income for an onion, so almost nobody did. The losses were capped by the very weakness that ought, on paper, to have made the market dangerous. Turn that around, and you have the genuinely uncomfortable version. The episodes that flatten economies are not the ones with flimsy paper. They are the ones where the obligations are perfectly enforceable, where the debt is real, secured, and collectible, and where the courts and the banks will make absolutely certain that somebody pays. A market that settles at 3.5% is embarrassing. A market that settles at 100% against houses is what ruins people. That is why the tulip analogy so often points in the wrong direction. It gets reached for when an asset looks absurd, when what actually matters is whether the absurdity has been financed with money that somebody has an enforceable right to get back. The hyacinth speculation that followed decades later is the control experiment. Same country, same trade, same pattern of a fashionable variety, soaring and then falling to a fraction of its peak. No national catastrophe, no chapter in Mackay, no place in the language. The difference was not the economics, the difference was that nobody wrote the pamphlet. The next time someone tells you that the Dutch went mad and ruined themselves over a flower, you'll know better. The flower was diseased, and the disease was what made it worth anything. The market was illegal, and its own participants had written that into their contracts. The crash was a refusal to pay, and the state resolved it by turning debts into options at 3.5%. Nobody documented in the archives went bankrupt. And the ruin you were taught about was written in 1841 by a man who had never checked. Follow the money, and there is barely any money to follow. That is the finding. The most famous financial catastrophe in history is mostly a literary one, and it has been doing the work of real analysis for 180 years. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the version with the archive receipts attached, subscribe. This channel follows the debts, the contracts, and the quiet settlements underneath the events you were taught as economics. And I want your argument on one thing. Of everything here, which do you think best explains what happened in 1637? The unenforceable contracts, the virus that capped the supply, the tiny closed network of traders, or the pamphlets that turned all of it into a national legend? Tell me in the comments, and tell me why. I read every single one of them. And if this changed how you use the phrase tulip mania, a like helps it reach the people still using it wrong.